this guy, Martyr spoke with Glenn Greenwald recently. And I heard about this guy originally on Tim Pool's show. I had no idea who he was at the time. You probably, if you've seen any of my previous streams, I did one where I showed some clips from Tim Pool's argument with Max Blumenthal where they mentioned him. And at that time I said, I have no idea what he's talking about. The guy's like, well, Martyr said this and da, da, da. But this guy is insanely on point. And it was really cool of Glenn Greenwald to interview him. It's like a half-hour interview. I of all the stuff I've showed tonight, this is the one thing I highly recommend you go watch in its entirety, because this guy is sharp, dude. He's very balanced in his takes, and he's done a lot of research and has a lot of knowledge on the subject, as you'll see in these clips that I pulled here. So we're going to start with this one where he talks about how Americans really don't have empathy for people in a war zone because we haven't been forced to live in one ever.
I've always been a book nerd and a history nerd, and I happened to come across that topic maybe about a decade ago, where I started really digging into it past the television news and sort of magazine article level. And I guess it was the shock that I had when I started looking into the topic and realizing that the picture I had of it, which was the typical picture most sort of Americans who know the topic at a surface level have, how far removed from reality that picture that I had was. And as I learned more and more about it, and got to know people on both sides of that conflict, I found that it's one of those topics that the more somebody learns about it, regardless of which side they're on, if they're on a side and they learn more about the topic, they will become more understanding and empathetic of the other side. It's just one of those topics where that's always true. And I think it's really easy to forget that you were touching on this quite a bit when you were talking about Ukraine. It's easy to forget in America what it's like to go through a tremendous amount of suffering and what that can do to a people. If you think back to Germany after World War I, if you think about the Russians now, people wonder how they can support Putin so strongly. Just go to Russia in the 1990s and find out what that place was like, and Putin was the guy in charge when that turned around. That's going to generate a lot of loyalty. If you go back to the U.S. Civil War, that was the last time we really had a war that affected Americans on a large scale. I mean, one out of every 18 or 20 men in America was a casualty in that war.
You might be able to argue Vietnam, maybe not on the same scale, but definitely had an effect on American people too.
Or down south, 1 out of every 5 military-age males was a casualty in that war. And everybody, after that war was over, really had this idea that was terrible. That was a bad idea. Even if it ended slavery, that was just a traumatic experience for our country. And there was a real push and a real feeling on both sides of the North-South divide that we needed to try to heal those wounds and move past that, because everybody had experienced the pain that came with that war. That was a century and a half ago at this point. And it was really the last time we had that kind of experience. And so now, when we look at a lot of these wars, I think we forgot what it's like to not just have your sons go off and die. That's awful. But to have your kids die in a war, to your small children die in a war, your wife die in a war. We just don't remember what that's like as Americans. And so we end up cheering it on as if it's a spectator sport.
Everything in this country related to politics nowadays is like a spectator sport. Look at the way that we rope ourselves off into the red and blue team as one example. So let's keep watching. This guy makes a lot of great points.
Indians is somehow much more foreign. Obviously, 9/11 didn't help with that, with our perception of the Muslim world. But when you get to know the people there, when you spend time in the West Bank, the emails I get from people who listened to the podcast series and actually came away with more sympathy for what the Jews were going through in Europe when they were driven to adopt Zionism as an ideology in the first place. These are just regular people. These are just regular people, and they have the same feelings, same emotions the rest of us have, right? And I think that we as Americans, when there's a conflict like the one that's going on between the Israelis and the Palestinians, we have the benefit of being able to step back, of being able to respond not emotionally to everything that's happening.
Not emotionally.
We really ought to take seriously our role as a peacemaker in situations like that. And actually, for quite a while, we did do that. I mean, say what you want about somebody like Bill Clinton, but he put a lot of work in to try to at least move the ball forward in the peace process.
I did not know that. Cheers to Bill Clinton.
And we saw that as our role in the conflict. And that has really all changed since maybe the mid 2000s or so, when now, I mean, from the highest levels of power all the way down to the people on the street and on Twitter, when this conflict kicked off, this most recent round of violence kicked off, it's as if people see it as their job to egg the other side on. And if the Israelis look, it's totally understandable after what happened on October 7th that the Israelis were going to be in a nasty mood, right? Like, you go back after 9/11, it would have been great if we could have stepped back, but that's asking a lot. Something like that happens, the country involved is going to want to do something about it just to get it back, and that's fine.
See also 9/11.
I understand that, but we as Israel's friend, as a country, and one that is disconnected from this, we ought to play the role of trying to talk them off that ledge.
So he makes a great point there that historically we were the peacemakers, but that dynamic has changed. I wonder why. It's not like it has anything to do with, I don't know, money.
Don't tase me, bro. Don't tase me. I didn't do anything. Ow! 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 Ow!
Okay, I'm sorry. I can't help it.
True. And so I think what a lot of people believe, Darryl, about this conflict is that, look, at the end of the day, no matter what else you want to say, you have Israel that's a democratic country and wants to live in peace with its neighbors. And then on the other hand, you have Muslims who just hate Jews and hate Israel and want to take Israel off the map. Their only goal is to kill all Jews. And therefore, there's no way to side with anyone but Israel, because Israel's the only one there trying to be humanistic and kind of noble and civilized. The rest are just these primitive, hateful people who hate Jews and want to kill them all.
No, I hear you. It's definitely a tiger by the tail.
What is your, what would you say to people who believe that?
You remember when we were kids and you would have your younger brother or maybe your younger cousin or something, and you were picking on him, bullying him a little bit, and you're holding him down, and maybe you're just torturing him a little bit just to show him you're stronger or whatever it is. And he gets really, really, really angry. He's like, let me up, you better let me up right now. And he starts fighting, struggling, maybe tries to bite your wrist or something to get you to let him go. And now at this point, you got to hold on because the little guy is really angry. And you tell him, I'm going to let you up if you stop struggling. And he's like, screw you, I'm not stopping. It's a similar situation to that in a lot of ways. There's no question that, and I think everybody, even very pro-Israel people, in my experience, when they really learn the history of the pre-1948 period, they come away with a lot of sympathy for what happened to the Palestinians. I mean, you're talking about 750,000 people who got driven out of their homes at gunpoint and not allowed to return, right? And those people's grandchildren are still in the places that they fled to. And that's a raw deal. You can have sympathy for what the Zionists were trying to do because of, the pogroms they were reacting to in Europe and everything. But there's no question that, the Zionists may have been jumping out of a burning building by going from Europe to Palestine but they landed on somebody on the way down on the sidewalk. And that guy got really angry because he didn't understand that there was a burning building that you were jumping out of. He just knows somebody landed on him and it hurts.
Or he didn't understand why it was that he had to give up his land because the Europeans had a Holocaust against the Jews. Like, the question was, why don't you in Europe give part of your land since you're the ones who did this? Like, how do we have to give up our land to pay for your crimes?
Valid point. And I think his burning building analogy is much better than the beating up your little brother analogy. Yeah, like, the Jewish people were in a precarious position. A lot of them had been killed. And let's keep in mind, the Holocaust did not just include Jewish people. It was mostly Jewish people, obviously. But the Nazis went after other minorities and handicapped people and basically anyone they didn't deem as fit for their master race, so to speak. So there is that side of it too. But the point he makes there is good, is that when people have perspective about what actually happened on both sides, they can empathize a lot better. And that's something that's obviously lost in today's culture. Let's keep going.
I mean, especially, most people, I think, when I talk to people about this, I realize a lot of the time that the average person thinks this is an ancient conflict. Like, it goes back thousands of years.
Right.
It's this ancient, it's ever since Ishmael and Isaac were born. They've just been at war. That's just not true. I've got a photograph.
I didn't know this.
From 1913, so the year before the First World War, and the year before business in Palestine really started to accelerate. And it's a picture from a cafe in Jerusalem, or I think it might be in Jaffa, actually, yeah. And it's a picture of a band playing in this cafe, and it's two Muslims, a Jew, and a Christian playing in a band together
in 1913.
It's not that long before the founding of Israel and everything spun out of control. Things were not, this was not a blood feud much more than 100 years ago. This is a modern political dispute that is very much the result of a modern ideology. It's not even really so much of a religion.
And also a lot of U.S. funding.
Just impulse, as much as Zionism does draw on, sort of ancient mythology to tie people to it and motivate people. This is a nationalist phenomenon. This is something that emerged out of modernity, out of Europe specifically, where nationalism was on the rise. And you had this group of people who needed a country. I mean, let's just, the lesson of the Jews in the last 1,000 years and the lesson of the Palestinians in the last 70 years or so is that everybody needs their own country. It's not good to be a minority in somebody else's country. It's better in some than it is in others, but it's nice to have somewhere to go. And the Jews needed that. And unfortunately, they did end up landing on somebody who had nothing to do with the situation. And, the United States, we actually recognized and had some level of neutrality in the situation up till about the late 60s, early 70s. Lyndon Johnson was like the first very strongly Zionist American president. And
interesting.
The presidents previous had misgivings. I mean, Eisenhower made the Israelis and the French and the British skedaddle from Egypt after the Suez Crisis in '56. And they weren't happy about that, but he didn't care. He had a Cold War to fight. Ever since then, we have been lock, stock, and barrel only for Israel. We don't care what the Palestinians' grievances are, just like we didn't care what the Russians' grievances were in the lead up to the Ukrainian war. There was a big kerfuffle over on Twitter the other day because.
So this next piece, he makes a lot of great points there. First of all, about the nature of the conflict and this idea that it's some ages old conflict, like some biblical level conflict. That's the kind of shit that's spread by not only Zionists, but also Christian fundamentalists who see the Holy Land as like the place where Christ is going to return and all that. So that's an interesting point that he made there. But in this next clip, what he talks about is how it's worthwhile for us to examine the motives of people who hate us. And that is something that is so lost on a lot of people. But check this out.
It's a letter to America about his reasons for 9/11.
So that, I don't know, recently this was trending on TikTok, and of course they censored it.
And just hearing for the first time kind of what his actual grievances were. And, that doesn't justify what people do or anything, but we ought to, like, if there's a long running conflict, especially, we should be having conversations about, like, okay, what is it these people are so upset about that they're willing to die in large numbers? They're willing to take on a state like Israel or a state like America. They're willing to incur our wrath because of something that's really apparently bothering them. What is it? We don't do that at all. We just, we put everything in the same framing that we use for World War II, where they're evil.
There it is.
They're irrational. You cannot possibly negotiate with these people. They don't have any legitimate grievances. They don't have anything driving them toward this conflict other than hatred for us and our way of life. And I think that most people don't actually.
I didn't think about it, but they use that exact same framing for post 9/11. Like, the terrorists hate us and our freedom, and that's just it. Like, it's not because we're in their countries killing their families. It's they just hate freedom.
Believe that. But for some reason, maybe it has to do with the media environment or just the structure of our democratic political system. The people who do take that line wield a disproportionate amount of influence in the discourse, right? And this is something that you see drive the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, especially. People, like you said, think that the Israelis want peace, the Palestinians don't want peace. That's totally just ahistorical nonsense, okay? There are good people on both sides who have worked extremely hard for peace.
Sound familiar?
Palestinian negotiators like Saeb Erekat, a lot of people who were very dedicated to trying to figure out a negotiated solution. They worked for years on it. And so did a lot of Israelis. And there are also elements on both sides, like Hamas, like the Likud party, especially as it is under Netanyahu, who truly do not want peace.
So yeah, we have to look at that through the lens of our own empire and the things that we've done over the last several years. And I think that's why a lot of the more intelligent people in media are going like, hey, remember what happened post 9/11 and how big of a mistake we all thought that we all agreed that was? Let's not do that again. Let's not let other people do that again. I mean, we've obviously continued to do it anyway, despite the will of the people. For reasons I won't go into right now, because I don't want to be called an anti-Semite.
No one in high school knew what the word anti-Semitic was until Ye made it popular.
I mean, everybody
pro
gets
Hamas, pro terrorism, pro Hamas,
who want to promote war.
Right.
Yeah, but the question is not what you think of Israel in a broad sense. It's not what you think of the history in a broad sense. Any of that stuff. Whether Israel has a right to exist. The question is Israel is Israel
such a good point,
meeting the standards of the first world democratic countries in the world for trying to avoid civilian casualties?
Yeah, because we're constantly told it's the most moral army, the IDF is the most moral army, and all that stuff. So this guy makes a solid point here, and
that's all. When I look at what they're, especially in the first several weeks of this conflict, you watch what they're doing. I don't think it's possible to make the case that they were living up to those standards. Something like when they hit the Jabalia refugee camp, and the Israeli spokesman, the IDF spokesman, was talking to Wolf Blitzer, and Wolf asked him, knowing there were civilians there, you still hit this thing. And the guy said, well, there might have been tunnels there. And my ears pricked up. I was like, might have been tunnels. And then he said, well, the terrorists that you were trying to hit there, did you kill them? And he said, we're looking into that. And it's like, you hit a refugee camp with 6 JDAMs based on the idea that there might have been tunnels there and that you might have had a guy that you were able to kill who was bad. I would want the American commander who ordered something like that in Iraq or wherever, anywhere in the world, I would want that guy put on trial. Like for some reason, we make exceptions for Israel that truly we would not make for our own forces. There is much more outrage over things that came out during the Iraq War than things that are really pretty overwhelmingly worse when you look at what's going on in Gaza and what's been going on for a long time. I mean, you're talking about you really have to remember, you're talking about a stateless population where half the population's women, half the population's under 18 years old. You're talking about maybe 20% of the population are men over aged 18. Maybe about, they think 12 to 15% of the population are men between 18 and 40. So like military age men, broadly speaking. These are people who have homemade rockets and AK-47s. And obviously they proved on October 7th that can do a lot of damage. That's extremely dangerous and is something that Israel has to take very seriously. But is that something that merits a regular military, full-blown military assault kind of response? The idea that Hamas uses human shields, I'm sure there's something to that. But that's, to me, not really the point. It's not their responsibility to look after these people. Hamas is a terrorist organization. Pretty much every country on Earth
Hamas the same privileges.
Is Israel behaving?
We afford Israel
something to that.
I keep missing the pause button and starting the video.
To me, not really the point. It's not their responsibility to look after these people. Hamas is a terrorist organization. Pretty much every country on Earth, their attitude toward Hamas is if you find one of them, kill him. That's how Hamas gets treated by the global community. There's no pretension that they are a first world democratic country that ought to be treated with respect at international, events and organizations, anything like that. Israel is that. Israel wants to be considered a respectable first world country, and we should hold them to first world standards. That's really.
So let me.
I mean, that is probably one of the best points that I've heard made on this issue, and like I said, I highly encourage you to go listen to this whole piece that Glenn Greenwald did with Martyr made, and I still I want to listen to his podcast. It's very daunting and long, but this guy went into the weeds and did research on the whole subject, and so he's very knowledgeable about it, and he talked to a lot of people in Palestine and in Israel. And like he said, there's people come away from it with sympathy for Israel as much as they do for the Palestinians, because Israel was in a very precarious position. And I love the analogy he made of someone jumping out of a burning building and landing on someone else. Like that's kind of what happened in a more, analogous sense, or it's a better analogy, I think, than the one he made earlier about beating up your little brother. But go listen to that. And I just want to show, in relation to this, I published this video as a short, but there used to be this show called Sledgehammer, and this is to end this on a kind of comedic note. There used to be this show in the 80s called Sledgehammer, and there's this scene where he's a cop, and his whole thing is he's just like a badass cop that sleeps with his gun and everything. It's like cartoonish, right? And so there's this scene where they call him and they're like, Sledgehammer, there's a sniper on the roof. And he shows up to the scene and the sniper's like shooting at people. And he just takes a bazooka out of his trunk and destroys the whole building. And I kind of made the analogy to what's going on right now with that. And it did all right as a short, but I'm going to show it again here real quick. Just because I think it's a good way to top off this clip here. So, all right, watch this real quick.
Sledgehammer!
All right, what's going on? I gotta get to work.
I've got a sniper on that roof.
Control is requested. Over.
Hammer, what are you doing? You'll get killed! think I got him.
I love how it ends with him. I think I got him.